My mother said it first when I was 17 in the kitchen on a Thursday evening after my brother Davis had gotten early acceptance to Davidson College, and the house was still warm from the celebration dinner. She said it lightly. The way people say things they believe are small compliments, she said. And Nora, you're our backup plan. She was talking to her friend Janet on the phone, and I was standing at the refrigerator 3 feet away, and she didn't lower her voice because she did not understand that the sentence required lowering. Davis was going to Davidson. He was going to be a corporate attorney. He was going to build the career that my parents had been architecting since he won the 4th grade science fair. And my father had said, that boy is going to change things. I was going to be a nurse, and in my mother's framework, offered warmly and without malice, a nurse was what you had in reserve when the big plan needed backup. I closed the refrigerator. I did not say anything. I went to my room and I thought about the sentence for a long time, and I decided at 17 on a Thursday in October that I was going to be the best backup plan she had ever seen. 11 years later, my father was admitted to the ICU at Presbyterian Hospital in Charlotte with a pulmonary embolism, and the attending physician who took my mother's call at 2 a.m. was a woman who had read my father's chart notes and who said to my mother, "Someone gave us an extremely thorough intake. Your husband's anticoagulation history, his prior DVT, his allergies, the specific contraindication with the medication they tried to give him in the ER." My mother said, "Who gave you those notes?" The attending said, "His daughter called ahead. She's a nurse." My mother said, "Yes." She said it the way you say the thing you have always known, but have never said in the right register before. The attending said, "She may have saved his life." My mother called me from the waiting room at 2:47 a.m. and said, "Nora." I said, "I know." She said, "You knew." I said, "I've been tracking his chart for 8 months." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Backup plan." She said it quietly, in the specific tone of a woman saying the wrong sentence back to herself in the dark. I said, "I'm on my way." I drove to Charlotte at 3 a.m., and I did not think about the sentence at all. I thought about my father's anticoagulation history and the 3 things I needed to confirm with the attending before the morning rounds. Before I take you back to the beginning, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely stays with you. Drop your city and the time in the comments. I always love knowing where you're watching from. My name is Nora Aldridge. I'm 28 years old. I am a clinical nurse specialist at a cardiovascular unit at a hospital in Greensboro, North Carolina, and a part-time adjunct clinical instructor at UNCG's nursing program, where I teach second-year students what it means to look at a chart before the chart becomes a crisis. I have been a nurse for 5 years, and I have been, in one form or another, the family's backup plan since I was 17. This is the story of what that sentence cost me, what I did with the cost, and what happened at 2 a.m. on a February night when the backup plan was the only plan that mattered. Let me take you back to Concord, North Carolina, a mid-sized city in Cabarrus County where the Speedway is the dominant architectural and cultural landmark, and where the neighborhoods range from the historic and maintained to the growing and practical. And my family was the latter, a house on Branchview Drive that my parents had bought when Davis was 4 and I was 2, and that had been in the 26 years since the container for a family that loved each other in the specifically unequal way of families that have organized themselves around one child's exceptional potential and one child's reliable presence. My father, Robert Aldridge, spent 31 years as an account manager for a manufacturing company in Kannapolis. He was a steady man, the kind who knew every neighbor's name, who showed up to things on time, who had strong opinions about the right way to maintain a vehicle and the correct temperature for grilling a steak. He was not a man given to sentiment. He expressed love through competence, through fixing the thing remembering the appointment, being where he said he would be. He was good at this. He was also in the specific way of men who express love through competence, sometimes better at showing up for the scheduled occasions than for the unscheduled ones. My mother, Patricia, had been an administrative assistant at a real estate firm for 22 years. She was the warm one, the connector, the person who brought food when someone was sick and remembered to ask the follow-up question a week later. She loved her children with the full and genuine love of someone who had wanted them both, and was grateful for them both. She also had a story about them that was specific and settled. Davis was the exceptional one, the one who was going to do something large with the particular intelligence he had been demonstrating since 4th grade, and Nora was the solid one, the reliable one, the one who would be fine and who would always be fine, and who was, the word was offered as a comfort, not a verdict, the backup. Davis was 2 years older. He went to Davidson. He went to law school at Wake Forest. He passed the bar at 26 and joined a corporate firm in Charlotte that was exactly the kind of firm my father described to his friends with the satisfaction of a man who has watched a plan execute correctly. He was not unkind to me. He was busy in the way of someone whose life has been organized around being excellent, and who has spent so much energy on the excellence that the people adjacent to it receive what's left. We were close in the specific way of siblings who share a history without sharing a daily life, warm at Christmas, texting occasionally, genuinely glad to see each other without always understanding each other completely. I was the one who was going to be fine. I understood this from a young age, not because my parents told me I would be fine. They told me they were proud of me, but because the texture of the household communicated it. The college fund was discussed in terms of Davis's options. My own options were discussed in terms of what was practical and good. Davis's internships were tracked and celebrated. My clinical rotations were noted and approved of. Davis's career trajectory was narrated. Mine was assumed. He was being built. I was being managed. The Thursday sentence, backup plan, arrived in this context and landed with the specific force of a thing that confirms something you have been feeling as ambient temperature for 17 years and have not yet found language for. My mother did not mean it cruelly. I want to say this clearly, and first, because the cruelty would be a simpler story, and this is not a simple story. She meant it the way people mean the sentences they say on the phone when they don't think anyone is listening, as a shorthand for something she believed and had not examined. The shorthand was, Davis is the primary investment. Nora is the contingency. I went to UNC Charlotte. Nursing, which I had chosen at 15 after a week in the hospital with a respiratory infection during which a nurse named Cheryl had been the person who explained what was happening in my body when the attending physician's explanation left me more frightened than I had been before. Cheryl had sat on the edge of my bed for 12 minutes and told me exactly what the medication was doing, what I would feel in the next 4 hours, what the signs were that would mean something was working, and what the signs were that would mean something wasn't. I had listened to all 12 minutes, and I had thought, that is the job I want. Not because it was romantic, because it was precise, because it was the specific application of knowledge to the moment when a person needed knowledge most. I wanted to do that. My parents supported the choice. They supported it the way they supported most things I chose, warmly without the organized investment of attention they gave to Davis's parallel choices. My father said, nursing is a good, stable career. He said stable the way some people say backup. I noted the register. I did not comment on it. I graduated from UNC Charlotte at 22. I passed my boards in September. I started at a cardiac unit at Carolina's Medical Center in Charlotte at 22 and a half, at the beginning of a career that I had been building toward since Cheryl sat on the edge of my bed and explained exactly what was happening. I was good from the first week, not confident, not impressive, but good in the specific way of someone who had been waiting to be in the right room and had arrived there. My nurse educator said at my 90-day review, "You have the clinical instinct we can't teach. We can teach everything else." I noted that. I kept working. My parents came to Charlotte occasionally for dinners. My father always ordered the same thing, and my mother always asked if I was sleeping enough, and Davis was always mentioned, a case he was working on, a promotion track he was being considered for, an apartment upgrade that was coming. I listened to all of it with the warmth I had developed for the texture of a household that had a center of gravity, and that I orbited rather than occupied. I was not diminished by it. I had built a center of gravity of my own, and I was standing in it. I started tracking my father's chart at 34. His own chart, not as his nurse, as his daughter, who was a nurse and who had begun, in the course of their Sunday calls, to notice something in the pattern of what he described about how he felt that did not add up to fine. He mentioned once, in passing, that his left leg had been swollen for 3 weeks, and his doctor had attributed it to the long drives he was doing for work. He mentioned it once more 2 weeks later, with a new detail. It had gone down and come back. I said, "Dad, has anyone talked to you about a DVT?" He said, "A what?" I said, "A deep vein thrombosis, a blood clot in your leg." He said, "My doctor didn't mention it." I said, "I want you to call your doctor tomorrow and ask specifically. Tell him about the pattern. Swelling, then resolution, then swelling again. Tell him you have a family history." He said, "What family history?" I said, "Grandpa Aldridge, his pulmonary embolism in 2009. My father said, "That was different." I said, "Maybe tell your doctor." He told his doctor. His doctor ordered an ultrasound. The ultrasound found a DVT in his left popliteal vein. He was started on anticoagulation therapy. I want to pause here and ask you something, and I need you to think about it before you answer in the comments. If you are a professional in a field, medicine, law, finance, anything, and your family consistently treats your expertise as a nice hobby rather than a real skill, when is the first time they actually listened? And was it before or after something went wrong? I have asked this to every nurse I know, and the answer is almost always after. Tell me your version. The anticoagulation worked. The DVT resolved. My father was good for 8 months, and then, in February, he traveled for 4 days to a business conference in Atlanta. Long flights, long sitting, a dehydration level he had not managed correctly. And he came home and went to bed, and woke at midnight with chest pain and shortness of breath. And my mother drove him to the ER, and a clot that had broken from the residual inflammation in his leg reached his pulmonary artery, and became the kind of event that either gets managed correctly in the first 30 minutes or becomes something else entirely. I had not known he was traveling to Atlanta. He had not told me because he had not thought to tell me, which is the specific way that parents who treat your expertise as a nice hobby do not naturally consult it. They do not think to consult it because consulting it would require acknowledging it as something more than a hobby, and they have not yet arrived at that acknowledgement. I found out he was in Atlanta from my mother's Tuesday text, which had said, "Dad's in Atlanta for the conference. Back Thursday." I had texted back, "Make sure he drinks water and gets up and walks every hour on the flights." She had sent back a thumbs up emoji. The thumbs up emoji was the symbol of someone who had received a recommendation and would not implement it. When my mother called at 2:14 a.m. and said, "Dad's in the ER. They think it's his heart," I was already awake. I had been awake since 1:30 when some combination of clinical instinct and accumulated worry had come through my sleep, and I had been lying there running the variables. I said, "What are his symptoms?" She said, "Chest pain, shortness of breath. His leg was..." I said, "The leg. Mom, which leg?" She said, "His left. The same one from before." I said, "I need you to do exactly what I tell you right now. I said, find the ER attending. Tell them DVT in left popliteal anticoagulation therapy for the prior 8 months. Therapy paused for the last 2 weeks because he was worried about a procedure contraindicated with heparin because of a reaction in 2019, and tell them his daughter is a CNS and is calling in 10 minutes. I said, write that down. She wrote it down. I called the ER attending while I was in my car pulling out of the parking garage. He had already seen the DVT history because my mother had delivered the message correctly. He had changed the treatment protocol. He thanked me. He said, your mother said you'd be calling. I said, she did. He said, she said you've been tracking this for 8 months. I said, yes. He said, good call on the popliteal history. The protocol they were about to use would have been contraindicated with the 2019 reaction. I said, I know. I said, how is he? He said, stable. We're moving him to the ICU for monitoring. He said, your mother says he's asking for you. I said, tell him I'm 40 minutes out. I drove to Charlotte at 3 a.m. in February on roads that were clear and dark, and the specific cold of a winter night in the Piedmont when the temperature has dropped after midnight, and the stars are very sharp. I did not think about the backup plan sentence. I thought about my father's chart and the 3 questions I needed to confirm with the attending before morning rounds, and the specific way that cardiac ICU units organize their monitoring protocols, and what that meant for the overnight observation. I was a nurse driving to a hospital where my father was in the ICU. I was doing my job. My mother was in the waiting room when I arrived. She stood up when she saw me, not to hug me, though that came, but first with the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for the person who knows what to do and has just seen that person walk through the door. She said, Nora. I said, tell me everything since the ER. She told me. I listened to all of it. I asked 4 clarifying questions. I went to the nursing station and introduced myself to the overnight charge nurse and asked to review his chart, and the charge nurse, who was a woman named Angela, who had 12 years in cardiac ICU, and who I recognized from a conference I had attended the previous year, said, You're Robert Aldridge's daughter? I said, Yes. She said, The attending said you called with the protocol history. She said, That heparin note probably kept him out of a bad situation. She said, Let me get you the chart. I sat with his chart for 40 minutes. I came back to the waiting room and sat down beside my mother, and I told her what I had found and what the plan was and what the next 12 hours should look like and what the signs were that everything was working correctly and what the signs were that it wasn't. I told her in exactly the way Cheryl had told me at 15, precisely, completely, with no information withheld and no information offered before she was ready for it. My mother listened to all of it. When I finished, she said, How did you know? About Atlanta, about what would happen. I said, I didn't know. I was worried. She said, You were worried because you know his history. I said, Yes. She said, You've been keeping his history. I said, For 8 months. She said, He didn't tell you he was going to Atlanta. I said, No. She said, He should have told you. I said, Yes. She said, I should have implemented the water recommendation. I said, Mom. She said, I sent the thumbs up. She said, I treated your recommendation like a polite suggestion. She said, I've been doing that with your work for a long time. She said, It's not a suggestion. It's expertise. She said, I know that now. I said, I know you do. I said, Let's talk about Dad first. She said, Okay. She said, Yes. She said, Of course. He was in the ICU for 3 days. He came home on a Saturday. He was quiet on the drive home in the specific way of men who have been close to something large and are processing the size of it without having the full vocabulary yet. He called me on Sunday, the first Sunday call he had ever initiated rather than returning mine. He said, I want to ask you some questions about what comes next. I said, okay. He said, medically, what do I need to understand about managing this going forward? I spent 25 minutes answering. He listened to all of it, and then he asked 6 follow-up questions that told me he had been listening with the specific attention of someone who has decided they are not going to treat the information casually this time. At the end of the 25 minutes, he said, you knew about Atlanta before anything happened. I said, I knew the risk when Mom texted me. He said, you told her to make sure I was drinking water. I said, yes. He said, she said you told her about the hourly walking to. I said, yes. He said, she said she sent a thumbs up. I said, yes. He said, I would have done those things if you'd told me directly. I said, I know. I said, I texted Mom because that's the channel. He said, I'm a channel now. He said, for things like this, for your medical recommendations. You call me directly, and I will do what you say. I said, okay. I said, that's a real change. He said, I know it is. He said, Nora. I said, yes. He said, what does a pulmonary embolism feel like? I said, what do you mean? He said, I mean, while it was happening. What was it like? I told him the clinical version. And then, because he was asking something more than that, I told him the experiential 1-2, what patients describe when they come through it, the specific quality of the fear that comes when your body is doing something serious and you do not know what it is or how serious. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I was scared. He said, I don't say that often. I said, I know. He said, you were the person I wanted. He said it simply, no preamble. When they were running the protocol, and I was asking for you, you were the person I wanted. He said, I knew you would know what to do. He said, I've always known that. He said, I didn't say it right. I said, no. He said, backup plan. He said it the way my mother had said it on the phone, quietly, in the dark, hearing the wrong version of what he meant. He said, that wasn't what I meant. I said, I know. He said, what I meant was that you were the one I could always count on. He said, that's not the same as backup. I said, no, it's not. I said, but the word matters, Dad. He said, I know. He said, I'm going to use better words. I said, good. I said, start with the medical channel. He said, done. He said, direct calls. What you say goes. I said, I'll be in touch. My mother called the following Tuesday. She said, I've been thinking about something, and I want to say it out loud. I said, okay. She said, I called you the backup plan. I said, you said it to Janet on the phone. I was 3 feet away. She said, I know. She said, I've been thinking about what I meant. She said, what I meant was that you were going to be fine, no matter what happened. That I didn't have to worry about you the way I worried about Davis. She said, I thought not worrying about you was a compliment to how capable you were. She said, I understand now that it meant I was putting less into making sure you had what you needed. She said, you took 2 buses to clinicals for a year. I said, yes. She said, you never said anything. I said, no. She said, because saying something would have become about Davis. I said, yes. She said, Nora. She said, I failed you in that. She said, not by loving Davis. By deciding you didn't need the same investment. She said, you needed it. You've always needed it. You just knew not to ask for it. She said, that's not capability. That's you managing a system that wasn't built fairly. She said, I built that system. She said, I'm sorry. She said, I mean it specifically, not as a general apology, as a named, specific thing I am responsible for. I said, thank you. I said, "That's the most useful thing you've said in this conversation." She said, "I know." She said, "Cheryl taught you to say things specifically." I said, "What?" She said, "The nurse who explained things when you were 15. You've mentioned her. I think about her sometimes." She said, "She taught you how to tell people the true thing when they need it." She said, "I'm trying to do that." I said, "You're doing it." I said, "Keep going." Davis called from Charlotte on a Thursday. He had driven to the hospital the second night and stayed 2 days, which was the most I had seen him present in a family situation in several years, and which told me that his father's ICU admission had landed with the same weight for him that it had for me, just through different channels. He said, "I talked to the cardiologist." I said, "Yes, I asked her to brief you." He said, "You asked her to brief me." I said, "You needed to understand the full picture." He said, "You coordinated my briefing." He said it with the specific, rueful recognition of a man who has just understood something about his sister he has not previously had to sit with directly. He said, "You've been managing Dad's cardiac history for 8 months." I said, "Since the DVT." He said, "I didn't know about the DVT." I said, "Dad didn't tell you?" He said, "He told me his leg had been swollen. He didn't mention the diagnosis." He said, "But you knew." I said, "I asked the right questions." He said, "When did you start asking the right questions?" I said, "Probably around the time I started being treated as the person who would be fine and didn't need things." He received that. He sat with it the way fair people sit with hard things, without deflecting, without minimizing, letting the weight land. He said, "Is that what the backup plan thing was?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Mom told me she said that." I said, "When I was 17. He said, "I was there." He said, "I didn't say anything." He said, "I should have." I said, "You were 19 and you'd just gotten into Davidson, and the house was celebrating." He said, "That's not an excuse." I said, "I know." I said, "It's context." He said, "Nora." I said, "Yes." He said, "You're the reason Dad came home." He said it plainly, not as a performance, as the specific factual statement of a man who has reviewed the events and arrived at a conclusion. He said, "The attending told me, if you hadn't called ahead with the protocol history, he would have been given something he was contraindicated for, and the outcome might have been very different." He said, "You saved him." I said, "I did my job." He said, "Your job is remarkable." He said, "I have not said that to you before." I said, "No." He said, "I'm saying it now." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I'm going to keep saying it." I said, "I know." I said, "Davis." He said, "Yeah." I said, "You turned out great." He said, "You too." He said, "Better, actually." He said, "Don't tell Mom I said that." I said, "She'll figure it out." He laughed. It was the laugh we had had since we were children, the specific laugh of two people who have been in the same house for a long time and find the same things funny, and do not always say so. I held it. Let me tell you where everyone is now. My father is stable. He is on a managed anticoagulation protocol that I helped design in consultation with his cardiologist, and he follows it with the specific compliance of a man who has been close to the consequence of not following it and has made a decision about that. He calls me directly with every symptom, everyone, immediately, the first time he notices it, before he decides it's probably nothing. We have had 6 of these calls in the past year. 3 were probably nothing. 3 required follow-up. He does not pre-sort them. He calls and lets me sort them. This is the arrangement we built, and it is working. He retired in March. He called me on the day he submitted the paperwork and said, "I'm done." I said, "How do you feel?" He said, "Lighter." I said, "Good." He said, "I want to do something." I said, "What?" He said, I want to understand more of what you do. The nursing, the clinical instructor piece. He said, could I come and observe some time? A class, or whatever you'd allow. I said, you want to come to my clinical teaching? He said, I want to understand what I've been calling a backup plan for 28 years. He said it with the specific dry honesty of a man who has decided humor is the vehicle for the true thing rather than the alternative to it. I said, I'll set it up. He came in April. He sat in the back of a simulation lab while I ran a second-year student through a cardiac assessment scenario. Afterward, he found me in the hall and said, You're extraordinary in that room. He said, the students, the way they look at you, they trust you completely. I said, I try to earn it. He said, you don't try. You just are it. He said, I understand now what Cheryl was. I said, what do you mean? He said, the nurse who explained things to you at 15. I understand now that she is the reason you do what you do, and that what you do is one of the most important things a person can do. He said, I'm sorry I called it backup. I said, I know, Dad. He said, I'm going to stop apologizing for it. I said, good. He said, because it's done. I'm not going back to that version. He said, I'm going to keep coming to things. If you'll have me. I said, I'll have you. My mother and I talk every Tuesday. She asks about my students, the second-year nursing students I teach, their progress, the ones who remind me of myself at 20. She asked once if I had a student who was the backup plan in their family. I said, probably a few. She said, tell them it's a good position to be in. Tell them the backup plan is the one with the real skills. She said, tell them the whole thing rests on them eventually, and they should be ready. I said, I'll tell them. She said, good. She said, I mean it. I said, I know you do. My best friend and nursing school colleague, Ramona Pierce, who has known me since we were in the same cohort at UNC Charlotte, and who was the first person I told about the backup plan sentence when it happened at 17, asked me last fall, do you feel like it's resolved? I said, I feel like it's honest now. She said, what's the difference? I said, resolved implies it's finished. Honest means we're all working from the true version of what happened. She said, is that better? I said, it's more durable. She said, because you can build on it. I said, because you can build on it. She said, Nora. I said, yes. She said, you called ahead to the attending at 2:14 a.m. from your car. I said, yes. She said, before you had confirmation, he was even going to make it. I said, yes. She said, that's the job. I said, that's the job. She said, Cheryl would be proud. I said, I hope so. She said, she'd be very specific about it. I said, she always was. She said, so are you. Here is what I want to say before I go. Backup plan is a sentence that sounds like a compliment and functions like a diminishment. It says, you are capable enough to not require our primary investment. You will be fine without what we give to the other one. You are not the risk. You are not the ambition. You are the thing we return to when the main plan needs supplementing. It is offered with love. It lands as an address that tells you where you live in the family's understanding of itself. And that address is contingency. I spent 11 years building my career in the address of contingency. I became the most competent version of the backup plan anyone had ever seen. I learned my father's anticoagulation history and tracked his symptoms and built the clinical picture of his cardiac health over 8 months of Sunday calls and direct questions, and the specific persistence of someone who has decided that the people she loves will not be harmed by her inattention, regardless of what address she has been given. I did this not to prove anything. I did it because it was right, and because it was my job, and because the job, when you do it correctly, does not ask whether you are the primary investment or the contingency. It asks whether you are present and prepared. I was present and prepared. At 2:14 a.m., I was present and prepared. My father's attending confirmed the protocol. My father came home. My mother called and said backup plan quietly in the dark and heard the sentence she had been saying for 11 years as what it was. She heard it differently at 78 than she had said it at 17. That is the work, not the vindication, the understanding, not the proving, the arriving together at the true version of a thing that had been wrong for a long time and is now, slowly and imperfectly, and with the specific work of people who have decided to do better, becoming right. If you have been called the backup plan, in those words, or in the texture of how your family organized itself around someone else, I want you to say this. The backup is what holds when everything else fails. The backup is what you return to when the primary plan has run out of road. The backup is the one with the skills that were built in the quiet over years without anyone organizing a celebration around them. Those skills are real. They are durable. They compound in ways that the primary plan does not always anticipate. Be so good at what you do that when they call at 2 a.m. your number is the one they reach for. Answer. Give them everything you have, not to prove the sentence wrong, because that is who you are, and that is what you are for. My name is Nora Aldridge. I am 28 years old. I am a clinical nurse specialist in Greensboro, North Carolina. My parents called me their backup plan from the time I was 17. At 2:14 a.m. on a February night, my mother called from an ER waiting room, and I called ahead to the attending from my car, and my father's chart had 8 months of my clinical attention in it, and the attending changed the protocol, and my father came home on a Saturday. Backup plan. Yes, the best one they had. Thank you for staying until the very end. If you have been the backup plan in your family, drop a comment. Tell me what the backup became when they needed it most. I read every single one. If this story found you in a moment where you are building something in the quiet that nobody has organized a celebration around, share it with the person who needs to know. The backup is the thing that holds. That it was always the thing that held. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.